Class number 3, we're going to talk about dynamics processing. Now, when we get to dynamics processing, one of the things that I think is probably most confusing to people in terms of working with mixes is dynamic processing, hands down, right? To me, I think this is something that is perhaps the most confusing thing to people because it's hard to understand what exactly that means and how to hear it. I don't think most people really know what to listen for when they listen to compressors. A compressor, right, just by simple definition, makes things more dense, right? So if you think about compressed air and you put all this air into a can, right, so it's heavily compressed, it serves a very particular purpose. So when you hit the nozzle on it, the air blows out with a very high intensity and a lot of pressure, and that allows you to blow dust off your computer or off your electronic components, right? So that's one example. Right? You can fill it into a balloon, right? And, so that gives you a balloon that you can play with and pop. And when you pop it, it makes a big loud noise, right? Compressors are important because what they do is they add density, right? And one of the concepts that I'm going to talk about a lot is a concept called frequency density. So it's not about the amount of frequency, it's about the density of those frequencies. And this is really where compressors are the key, okay? Because you can have a lot of low end on a sound, and that low end will sound really muddy, right? And just cloud up your mix entirely. And what you really need is not a large amount, right, or a lot of density. What you really need, like if I could actually draw it, right? Let's just say that I had like, all of this, low frequency energy. What I really want to do, and it just clouds up, right, my speakers. What I really want to do is I want to take all of that, okay, and I want to shrink it down, right, so that it's more focused, that it's more dense, and I feel the impact of it. So in other words, if I took like a pillow, right, and a feather pillow, right, and I just threw the feather pillow at you, you'd say, okay, yeah, I could feel the feather pillow. But if I could crunch that feather pillow up into the size of, say, like a regular normal size pillow, if I could crunch it up into the size of, say, like a softball, now the total weight of that pillow, let's just say it's 5 pounds, is now compressed into a smaller area. And when I throw that at you, right, now because the energy hits a more focused area, you feel the impact of that 5 pounds more than you would feel if it's sort of spread out. And that's really what compressors do. They shrink the size of things. Overcompression will shrink things down to the size where they become so small that you lose the impact of them. So somewhere in the middle, and they become thin and pinched and kind of annoying sounding. And this is the way that people misuse compressors quite a lot. Somewhere in between, there's a balance where you can focus the density of a particular, group of instrumentation, right? And you can take all of that instrumentation and you can focus the sound of those individual instruments and make it so that when you listen to them, you actually really see them, right? The visual sense of them becomes great. Like when you listen to a mix, right, and you hear a vocal and you love the sound of the vocal, it just sounds like right in front of you. It sounds big, sounds focused, sounds beautiful, just like right in front of your face, right? That's what I'm talking about. Compression is one aspect or a big part of that, right? And it works conjunction with different frequency areas. Now, there is an aspect of this which is maybe a little bit difficult to get into, but the whole purpose of working with compressors, and one of the things that I'm going to talk about here is the fact that what I'm going to have, hold on one here, sorry, just don't need to. I was going to pause my syncing here on my, so I don't have things kind of downloading that I don't need. We're going to talk about the ADSR cycle. So those of you guys who get into synthesis, you know about attack, decay, sustain, and release. And so when you have a sound, it has an envelope, a shape to it. And so what you have is an initial transient peak. That's the attack. Once that peak occurs, there's usually an initial decay, right? That's very short. Then you have a sustain, and the sustain area is how long the sound holds on for, right? And then you have a release cycle, which is once the note is let go, how long does it take for the sound to dissipate into nothing, right? And so what compressors allow you to do is they allow you to control ADSR. The way fundamentally a compressor works is by some basic controls. You have a threshold, right? And the threshold will set a trigger point, a point at which the compression starts to kick in. Then the next setting is the attack setting, and the attack setting determines how long it will take before the compression is applied, right? So if I set the attack to be instantaneous, it's going to attack this peak and limit this peak signal. If I set it to say, 15 milliseconds, or 10 milliseconds, it's going to bypass the peak and start to attack at the initial decay, right? Or I could set it a little bit longer and then it starts to attack the sustain, right? So I could actually increase the dynamic sound of this particular instrument by setting the attack time longer so that the transient peak relative to the rest, so basically what it's doing is it's taking the sustain signal and bringing it down, and then so what's happening is the transient peak relatively is higher, so I can increase the attack by compressing the sustain, right? I could pull the attack in closer to the sustain level by setting the attack quickly. The release time determines how long the compression holds on for, right? So the threshold is the trigger, right? The attack determines when or where the compression occurs, right? So that's where the compression occurs in the ADSR cycle. The release determines how long that lasts, right? If I set the release to be fast, it will have kind of a boomerang effect, right? And a medium release will give us me sort of a pumping and breathing kind of movement, right? If I do a slow release, then it will have a more stabilizing, right, or evening out of the instrumentation of whatever instrument that I'm applying the compression to. The amount of compression is determined by the ratio, right? The ratio determines the amount of compression. Okay, so once the threshold is exceeded, if my ratio is 20:1, for every dB above threshold, it goes 20 dB of gain reduction is applied, right? So for every 20 dB above threshold, 1 dB is allowed to come out, right? So that's pretty dramatic. So this determines the amount of compression, right? There's also some additional controls like a knee, which determines how aggressively the ratio is applied. So the knee is sort of a subsidiary characteristic, right? It determines how the ratio is applied to the audio signal, how the compression is applied. Okay, and those are your basic characteristics, and then you have a makeup gain at the end, which makes up for the gain reduction that occurs over the course of the compressor. So these are the basic settings. Okay, now what happens in the 3D sound field with compression is that when I actually have an audio signal, and I'm going to look from the top side view, and so let's go back here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my brush here and create an audio signal. And now I'm going to move this signal around here, right? So let's show you what happens. When I compress the attack of a signal, it makes the sound recede back on the speakers. So why does this happen? This happens because the attack, right? The initial attack of the audio signal, if it's very sharp and present, will give the sense that something is up close to you. Okay, and that's very true of audio in the real world. If somebody's talking to you and they're very up close, you hear the articulation of every little thing in their voice, right? You hear all the detail, right? The spit inside their mouth, right? Everything, what they ate, right? Exactly, everything, right? You hear like with incredible detail, and the amount relatively of dry to, reverberant signal is very low, right? So you have like this, real focus. If that person is talking from across the other side of the room, it's not just that you hear more reverb relative to that. There's also a limitation in frequencies. You lose high frequencies and low frequencies over distance. So all of that goes on. But you also lose the articulation because that initial attack that pops out becomes evened out. Right? It gets compressed or lost in the transmission across the room through all the air particles hitting each other. So that transient peak is not as sharp. So by limiting the attack, you can move a sound back in the speaker. And by allowing the attack to come through and compressing the signal after, it will become more present. Right? If you apply a form of compression where the signal is actually pumping and breathing, what you're actually getting is this front-back movement, right? So if you have a drum kit, the way that you get that drum kit to be pumping and breathing and sound really big in a space is you have a fast attack, and then you set the release time to kind of have a musical movement. So what happens is the drum sound sounds distant in the back of the room because of the fast attack, and it sounds really big, like it creates this space because of this movement that gives you the sense of this big size space. If you allow the attack to come through, then the signal becomes very present. And so what happens is at the articulation points, the signal jumps out very quickly towards you and then recedes back into the speaker, right? That's the basic concept. And so what you're doing is you're getting this front back movement with the compression. Okay, and that's really one of the whole keys. So we're adding density, which is the focus of the instrument, and then we're creating movement, dynamic movement, or we're making things static. So I could take, if I have an acoustic guitar and an electric guitar panned in the same location in the speakers, they may interfere with each other. But if I compress one with a fast attack and one with a slow attack, the one with the slow attack will sound like it's up front, and the one with the fast attack will sound like it's back behind the other instrument, right? So that's really critical. So what we're doing is we're taking that transient peak and limiting it, right? And that's really one of the keys to compression. So you can move signals front back, and this enhances the level, right, which moves things front and back, right? So the panning moves things left and right. The level control works in conjunction with the compression and determines its relative location to the other instrumentation, right? And that's the basics of compression, right, in terms of the way that that works. So we're really controlling the attack, decay, and sustain and release, right, of the audio signal. Now there are different forms of compression, okay? The most common compression that we hear about is downward compression. So essentially there are three forms of compression, right? So let me just go back to another tool here, right? So there's three basic forms of compression, okay? The most common is downward compression, right? So the signal, you have a threshold, any signals above threshold get compressed, right? So the gain goes downward. You also have what's called mid-band compression. And in mid-band compression, you sort of have an area that you can define in which you compress audio signals. So anything that falls within this area will get compressed together and pulled together this way. And then usually at the output, the gain is made up, right? So what this does is it allows you to tighten up an individual performance, right? So any kind of movement within this middle range is there, but it doesn't really affect the dynamics of the transient peaks, the attacks of the instrument. So we're taking the mid-level stuff and compressing it, pulling it together, right? So this is about, controlling stuff from the top down. This is about controlling stuff in the middle, and then you have upward compression. And upward compression works with signals below threshold. So when the signal passes below threshold, that signal that is now, say, 10 dB below threshold now gets compressed upwards. So now it's 5 dB below threshold, which means that it has an increase in gain. And so this brings up presence energy. A lot of the energy that is lost, the detail, is mostly low-level information, right? So usually what you have here is the attack, right? It's up at the top, right? So these are the transient peaks. The mid-range is usually the sustain, right? That's the note of the instrument. And the low-level stuff here is all of the presence of the instrument. This is where all of the reflections and the minor details, those details that really, really add definition to something, right? That add the detail. And bringing this up pulls things out of the speakers towards you because it adds that articulation that you hear when things are up close to you, right? So does this make sense? How many people have I just completely lost here through all of this? So hopefully, this is really, digging in and making sense. But these are the three basic forms of compression, right? This is how you start working. And so with digital, so much of this is so easy. And I'll show you tools, right, of how to apply all these different forms of compression and how you use them and where they fit into a mix, right, and how we move things around. So now we got some dynamic control, right, on a basic level. Okay, so let's forge forward here. So that's class 3. So that's the basics of dynamic processing and how you hear compression and a practical application to compression, right? So that's class 3.